Welcome everyone to this evening's discussion. And we are featuring today the Center for Armenian Studies workshop titled Dispossessions and its Legacies, Comparisons, Intersections, and Connections. My name is Melanie Tanielian, and I'm the current director for the Center of Armenian Studies at the University of Michigan. And I would, of course, first and foremost, like to thank our organizers for this event, our two Makhdoumian postdoctoral fellows, Matthew Ghazarian and Helen Makhdoumian, who will take over in just a minute, as well as Hakem El-Rustam, who has collaborated with Helen and Matthew to put this together. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Department of American Culture, Department of English, Language and Literature, the Department of History, the Donia Human Rights Center, as well as the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, the Department of Sociology, and the Society for Armenian Studies. And of course, Naira Tumanian, our program specialist who is running the webinar and as always is pulling everything together for us. So tonight's workshop focuses on the historical instances and aesthetics representations of dispossession, its violence, and its persisting legacies in the former Ottoman Empire and its diasporas. Therein, the workshop, which carries over 2 days, hopes to bring together Ottoman, Middle Eastern, and Armenian studies and put them into conversation with settler colonial studies, critical indigenous studies, and global histories of colonialism and capitalism. Invoking dispossession as a point of comparison and the framework for the discussion, the workshop joins recent works in Armenian studies and Ottoman studies, which has begun to explore chains of displacement and dispossession under conditions of what some have called internal colonization. The hope tonight and tomorrow is for these works that have been published in recent years in the field of Armenian studies to come into conversation with the distinct yet inseparable fields of settler, colonial, and indigenous studies, and ask how they might inform and complicate understanding of territorial removal, the settler, native, binary, and indigenous transnationalisms. We set out this evening with 2 keynote talks that we hope will set the tone for our full day workshop tomorrow, for which I hope you will all join us. And we have a fantastic lineup, but I will pass the floor to now Helen and Matthew, who will introduce our speakers and also moderate the discussion afterwards. So thank you, Matthew and Helen, for putting this together, and I'm looking forward to tonight's talks.
Thank you, Melanie, for these opening remarks. And thank you to our participants, our keynote speakers, our fellow organizers, and all of you for being here. So I'm going to introduce each of our keynote speakers in turn, just in the order on the program. So I'm starting with Robert Nichols. Dr. Nichols is Associate Professor of Political Theory in the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota, where he specializes in contemporary political theory, critical theory, the history of political thought, 19th century imperialism and colonialism, and the contemporary politics of settler colonialism and indigeneity in the Anglo-American world. Before joining the University of Minnesota, Dr. Nichols was Alexander von Humboldt Faculty Research Fellow in the Department of Philosophy at Humboldt University in Berlin. And he's also held academic posts at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, the University of Alberta, the University of Cambridge, and Columbia University. He has written books, including The World of Freedom, Heidegger, Foucault, and the Politics of Historical Ontology, out from Stanford University Press in 2014, and more recently, Theft is Property, Dispossession, and Critical Theory, out from Duke University Press in 2020. In Theft is Property, Nichols traces concepts of dispossession to explain historical and contemporary forms of law, property, Race, and Rights, in conversation with Indigenous, Black radical, feminist, Marxist, post-colonial, and other sorts of thinkers from the past 2 centuries. Nichols argues that a recursive process of systematic theft lies at the heart of modern regimes of private property that we know today. Nichols' work has enjoyed support from the Fulbright, Humboldt, Killian McKnight, and Trudeau Foundations, as well as from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Today, he will deliver a keynote address entitled Dispossession in Global Comparative Context. Without further ado, I present you all with Dr. Robert Nichols.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Matthew, for that very generous introduction. And thank you so much to Melanie and to Matthew and to Helen for the invitation to speak to you all today, as well as all the work that goes on behind the scenes to make something like this happen. I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to be here and to kind of share with you a little bit of what I have been working on over the last little while. I only wish that we could all be together in person, but I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you remotely, at least today. So a couple of just kind of really quick caveats before I get started with the content of my talk today. The first is to sort of recognize at least that I have a pretty old school style of presentation, so I do intend to sort of read a paper here. But I'm happy to, of course, entertain questions or comments afterwards to elaborate on points that are raised. I'm also going to be drawing a little bit here upon the book project that Matthew mentioned, Theft is Property. So I'm going to be referring periodically to some of the work that I tried to develop in that book. I'll try to elaborate in new ways from that and sort of extrapolate from it a little bit to put it more into conversation with some of the work that's being done by the people here. And I, of course, very much look forward to learning more about your work either in the Q&A or tomorrow. So with those kind of caveats in mind, let me just launch in with my talk here. So one of the signature contributions, I think, of the dialectical tradition of critical social theory, at least as far as I understand it, is the basic insight that relationships of domination, and I think in particular exploitation, are in a fundamental and non-trivial sense contradictory. They are so because despite the fact that subordinate parties are denigrated and denied the validity of their autonomous subjecthood, these parties are in fact more important to the actual material reproduction of the relationship itself. This is true of Hegel's famous dialectic of lordship and bondage, but it also characterizes Marx's analysis of the relationship between the bourgeoisie and proletariat. To say that this basic idea casts an enormous shadow over the 20th century is, of course, only to understate the issue. It is core also to a wave of decolonial struggles, which sought to transpose the terms of this relationship onto a global scale, where it came to serve as a prototype for thinking through the relationship between the so-called global North and the global South, a perspective pithily summarized by Frantz Fanon in his observation from Wretched of the Earth that, quote, Europe is literally the creation of the third world. In a different way, this observation has also found resonance within a host of feminist movements, but especially the social reproduction lineage, whose leading thinkers, such as Silvia Federici, have likewise sought to demonstrate that patriarchal relations operate by concealing the conditions of their own reproduction. Today, there are shades of this idea contained too in the paradoxes that attend backlash politics with regard to migration trends, since, as even right-wing commentators on the issue must occasionally concede, the West is deeply dependent for its material reproduction on precisely those immigrant populations who are so often denigrated in the context of these debates. Finally, one might add that at the heart of this core idea contains more than a mere diagnosis of power relations as contradictory. It also entails an implicit theory of revolutionary change, since if it is the case that subordinate parties are objectively more important to the material reproduction of the overarching social relations, then it would seem a key component of transforming these relations is to make the oppressed and exploited aware of their contradictory role. Hence the central place that consciousness-raising activities have played in the history of resistance movements understood within this broad rubric. Now, as important and influential as this dialectical tradition has been to the history of late modern and contemporary social critique and emancipatory struggle, it has, I think, always been attended by a less celebrated minor or sotto voce tradition, which has never been, I think, as easy to characterize or place. This awkward lesser cousin to the grand dialectical model can likewise be reduced for our purposes here to at least another simple but undeniable observation, namely that huge swaths of the human population do not even enjoy the paradoxical and perverse luxury of being exploited. These so-called surplus populations have likewise been theorized under a diversity of headings. I'm thinking here of the lineage that's often traced back to Marx's early yet somewhat peripheral comments on the so-called lumpen proletariat, or reserve army of unemployed. Focus on these communities has of late been resurrected under various names such as the precariat, or complemented with more Foucauldian-inflected studies on necropolitics and racialized surplus populations. Such communities are not even required for the extraction of surplus value through exploitation of their labor, and thus have been rendered more vulnerable to elimination, either through mass displacement and relocation, or even more ominously through genocide and extermination. When your body is not even needed as a tool of exploitation, what leverage capacity do you enjoy over the machinery of power? Where does that leave the agency of surplus populations in relation to the forces aligned against them? A broad set of conceptual or theoretical puzzles emerge out of this, namely of how to characterize these processes and categories that include things like removal, displacement, extermination, superfluousness, and the like. In my work, I've attempted to take up just one small set of these larger questions by thinking it through one particular vocabulary that's emerged over the years to characterize at least one subset of these processes and communities, namely dispossession and the dispossessed. I've been concerned to interrogate the language of dispossession, not because I think it to be a final, definitive, or sufficient overarching vocabulary, but rather because I'm keen to understand what comparative difference it makes to frame struggles outside of the classical dialectical model of domination and exploitation as something like a process of dispossession versus using some other critical idiom to characterize it. Along the way, I hope too to historicize the term, that is, to understand the emergence of the category and language of dispossession and the political and conceptual stakes of its deployment. So let me speak a little bit here to how I tried to understand dispossession, to historicize it, and to reconstruct at least one possible version of its conceptual intention. In recent years, over the past few decades indeed, the concept of dispossession has, I think, been pressed into service by scholars working across a wide range of fields. It's been employed recently by such influential thinkers as David Harvey and Judith Butler, but more interestingly and importantly for my purposes, it has also been drawn upon extensively by Indigenous scholars and activists in their shared project of analyzing and critiquing, in particular, the history of settler colonization. In that context, dispossession is commonly used to refer to the territorial acquisition logic of settler colonization, particularly as a means of differentiating it from other forms of imperial rule. So a standard model of imperialism is typically thought to be pyramidal. A relatively small number of imperial elites move into a new region and dominate over a relatively large population, which constitute a racialized laboring underclass, with the express purpose of exploitation and the extraction of value. Anglo-settler colonization, at least, operated in a distinct manner from this imperial model. In general, Anglo-settler elites did not move into the new regions of the Americas with the primary intent of subordinating indigenous peoples and coercing them into exploitative labor conditions. Rather, the primary aim was effectively to eliminate and replace indigenous societies. This required access to securing access to their lands, which was to become the territorial foundation of these neo-European transplant societies. So in this context, basically, dispossession names the distinctiveness of this territorial acquisition logic. However, insofar as activists and intellectuals seek to leverage this concept in this way, a number of conceptual difficulties arise, I think. And we have seen, as I track it in my work, the emergence of a certain kind of dilemma or paradox. And I think it goes something like this: that to speak of dispossession is to use a negative term. And it's negative both in the ordinary language sense, that is, it's a pejorative condition or something to be avoided. But it is also negative in the more philosophical sense, in that it is a term that's defined by the absence of some other attribute. Now, most intuitively, to suffer a condition of dispossession is to experience a privation of possession. And in this common everyday sense of the term, dispossession then is referring to some normatively objectionable loss of possession or proprietary control. Essentially, it's a species of theft. However, insofar as this is implied, it does drive adherents into a paradox or dilemma. Now, I think there's a general version of this and a more specific one. The general version is encountered in a number of other strands of critical theory. And that's because most critical theorists of various stripes are generally skeptical about the emancipatory potential of framing social relations as an extension of property relations. This is true, I think, of many working within Marxists, but also feminist and critical race theorists as well. So the general concern here is that to frame colonialism as a form of dispossession is to reinforce rather than to undermine a general logic of property or possession. Availing oneself of this language then strengthens the grip that this logic has over our moral and political vocabulary, and thus it may be contradictory or conservative or even self-defeating relative to our other broader goals and aspirations. There is, however, a more specific version, I think, of this concern that arises in this particular context, which puts the point even more directly. In the particular context with which I am working, to describe territorial acquisition as a form of dispossession appears, of course, to commit oneself to a claim about original possession. More precisely then, critics of indigenous movements who draw upon this language commonly charge them with lodging a contradictory mixture of claims. The mixture of claims are something like that on the one hand, the earth does not belong to anyone, and on the other, that it was stolen from its original owners or claimants. This, of course, appears to both presuppose and resist the language of possession, something which critics use to drive proponents up onto the horns of this dilemma. Now, in my work, I try to work through a set of concrete examples of this in a political and legal contexts. I'll just draw one specific example from the book to illustrate the point here. And it's an argument that began in the early 2000s in the Australian context out of a certain kind of historians debate in that location. There, certain right-wing, more populist historians began to develop the argument that to the effect that Australian Aborigines had no word for property in their language, or at least not landed property, and perhaps not even land in the contemporary European sense. That is to say that they had no sense of land as a bounded juridical object in which an individual or a group of individuals could hold exclusive proprietary title. The conclusion that some of these theorists and historians drew from this was that Australian Aborigines could not rightly claim to be the victims of a theft over a thing that they themselves did not conceptualize as an object in which they, or anyone else for that matter, had an exclusive title claim to. So effectively, no property, ergo no theft. Now, in many of the particular examples of these kinds of arguments, it's fairly easy to see them drawing specious and self-serving conclusions, particularly white settlers who are using this in order to reinforce their own private property kinds of claims. But what they do, I think, more effectively is draw upon an interesting premise. After all, there is something peculiar about the narrow conception of land that one commonly employs within such legal and political debates. Although it does appear to be an obvious empirical object, land is, of course, a concept, and in fact, a highly abstract one is that. That is to say, land as a legal and philosophical concept is not, in fact, universal and may actually be quite unusual and exceptional. So I think that while the particular examples that come from those thinkers may be spurious and self-serving, they are drawing upon a certain kind of vulnerability at the heart of language and a key ambiguity at the heart of the concept of dispossession. And indeed, there are even more sympathetic, critical, or progressive versions of this critique as well. There are many other, for instance, Marxist theorists who would be likewise ambivalent about drawing upon a kind of proprietary language in order to critique something like colonialism and its imbrications with capitalism. And finally, I should say, I think that this is not just an arcane or academic debate, but it is a real contest within political and legal venues that has high stakes. So it matters to figure out how we might respond to or confront an argument of such as this. There are, I think, a number of different ways that a person might respond to a concern of this sort. One might, for instance, simply insist that the premise is descriptively false. Some indigenous peoples, at least, do have clear express property claims or title claims to land, in which case what they may be describing when they're using the term dispossession is simply theft in the perfectly ordinary sense of the term. A second way to address the problem would be to say that the critic misunderstands the use of the term dispossession. That is to say, although we're using the word, it's just a trivial semantic oddity that it happens to contain within it the notion of possession. In this rendering, then, the dispossession is just a term of art. It's a metaphor. It's not an actual property or proprietary sort of claim. It could, for instance, on this second iteration, be used interchangeably with other kinds of terms, such as desecration, for example. In examples where people draw upon non-proprietary language of the desecration of the land or defilement of the earth, they're trying, I think, effectively to get out of the trap or the dilemma of dispossession that I've sketched by reversing the standard proprietary model, insisting, for instance, that the land does not, in fact, belong to us, but rather we belong to it, a common refrain that one hears in indigenous struggles up to the present. So if the core of the dilemma consists in holding the following two claims together, that is, the earth belongs to no one and it has been stolen from us, then you'll notice that the first two strategies I mentioned attempt to resolve the contradiction by simply dropping one or the other of the claims. The first strategy does so by affirming that the earth does in fact belong to someone and it has been simply stolen from its original and proper owners. The second strategy asserts the opposite. The earth belongs to no one, and thus it has not really been stolen from anyone at all. These are, I think, two methods, two strategies for evading what I call in my work the dilemma of dispossession. Either one appears to have to claim a proprietary relationship to the earth, in which case one risks universalizing and backdating property relations as the appropriate normative benchmark, or one disavows the property claim and risks undercutting the subsequent force of a claim that one is the victim of theft. Effectively, my work attempts to advance a third option, one that I think attempts to at least have our cake and eat it too, so to speak, since I propose embracing rather than evading the contradiction. I submit that the supposedly contradictory nature of these kinds of arguments arise not out of a conceptual confusion, but are rather the expression of an appropriate response to a very particular historical process. To see this, however, we have to first reconstruct something more of the contributions of Indigenous intellectuals over a longer period of time. So what I attempted to do in my work is to survey dozens of legal documents pertaining both to treaty relations and homesteading acts, that is to both public and private law, in order to understand better the interactive relationships between these different dimensions of law in Anglo-settler societies, as well as the range of Indigenous peoples' responses to these legal dilemmas. And in so doing, I suggest that a distinctive kind of process may be really at work here, which may in fact be usefully described as dispossession in a very specific and narrow sense of the term. So how do we kind of hold these two things together and think about the term dispossession as naming something peculiar about the interrelationship between these two sides of the process? Well, I think it goes something like this. That in this context, at least, we can observe that two processes which are normally thought distinct have been driven together. Namely, we find first the transformation of non-proprietary relationships into proprietary ones, so a kind of propertyization. And that this is taking place simultaneously as the systematic divestment of the newly created object of property from one party to another. So we're not just observing the simple transfer of property, but rather the transformation into property through the process of transfer. That is to say, the making and taking of property have been combined into a single moment. Once you see it this way, I think it's entirely possible to object to both aspects or elements of this. That is, to object to both the propertyization and the divestment component of it. And so in my work, I'm trying to think through the legal mechanisms of this, that is to understand how exactly this takes place in legislation and its attending jurisprudence, as well as trying to track how this spreads from a very particular, I think, 19th century US frontier system of legislation that effectively exonerates squatting and illegal occupation through a kind of backward process, recursively using extra legal force and occupation as a means to extend and expand property relations. The shorthand version of it for here is that in this Anglo-settler context, the legal and racial category of Indian begins to emerge at the same time to name a claimant over a new kind of property right. That is, a property right over a new object, this legal entity called land. But the process of naming Indians as claimants over land is done largely in a negative form. In the work, I refer to this periodically as a kind of structurally negated form of property claim, since what I mean by it is that Indians gain a right to land, but a right that can only be effectively actualized by alienating it to someone else. So to understand this, consider that kind of in its most general form, a property right is commonly thought of as having a tripartite structure. If I have property in something, I bundle a right to acquisition, to use and enjoyment, and then to alienation. That is to say, I have a legitimate right to have obtained the object in question, to use it as I see fit, and then to alienate it as I see fit. That is to sell it or dispose of it or bequeath it to my inheritors and the like. Now, in this context, I think Indians as a legal and racial category gain a strange sui generis kind of landed title, which has been extended to them, which is what I mean by the sort of process of making property, but it has been extended to them in such a way that it can only be fully expressed in the third moment of a property right, that is, in the moment of alienation. Accordingly, it is a kind of right that is actualized only when it is negated. In effect, the dispossessed come to have something they can't do anything with, except determine to whom they might divest it. In my language, then, this is a recursive relation. In a normal situation, of course, you would assume that property is logically, chronologically, and normatively prior to theft. Any claim regarding theft has to presuppose property as its prior condition. But in this case, rather than property and theft existing in a sort of strictly linear relation, they're related recursively. What we're talking about then is effectively a property-generating form of theft. As such, in this context, possession is not the presupposition of dispossession, but is rather its effect. So grasped, there's nothing logically or incoherent about objecting to both parts of this notion. The notion that the earth is not property, and yet it has been stolen, is not a contradiction, but is rather an insight into the recursive relationship between theft and property in colonial contexts. And this, I think, is what the concept of dispossession usefully names. Let me conclude then with just a few thoughts about what we might call the moment of recomposition. The primary thrust of my work and the comments that I've offered here today have been mostly organized around attempting to grasp the specificity of a process or set of processes that have led to the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in the Anglophone settler colonies of the 19th, 20th, and now 21st century. The rationale and underlying motivation for such a study is the conviction that these processes and experiences have been too often subsumed between larger and more dominant narratives. Narratives of triumphant nationalism, civilization, and manifest destiny, to be sure, but also more dominant narratives within critical theory, preoccupied as that tradition has been with questions of exploitation, the industrial proletariat, and the typically white male agent of revolutionary struggle. So if I seek to understand something about the specificity of Indigenous political histories and their contributions to an increasingly globalized conception of critical theory, then this specificity must be thought of as a moment in a dialectic of differentiation and recomposition. Put more concretely, if Indigenous peoples in the Anglo-settler world have experienced a very peculiar form of dispossession, then it still remains necessary to understand the relationship between this colonial dispossession and other processes taking place in the broader global context. After all, if Indigenous peoples are targeted for a particular form of dispossession through landed property, this is in part due to their relative superfluousness as a racialized laboring underclass. And that condition, in turn, can only be explained by the large-scale importing of surplus labor from abroad in the form of the indentured poor of Europe and the enslaved populations of Africa. That dispossession took on a specific phase for Indigenous peoples is therefore intimately connected to other histories of displacement, proletarianization, and enslavement abroad. Returning to my opening remarks then, if this is true, then we must think of exploitation and expropriation as analytically distinct but practically intertwined processes. The removal of Indians from their lands took labor power, and for that labor power to be organized and controlled, it took space and land. Thus, the lessons I draw from this, which I very much take into me with the discussions today and tomorrow, when I'll be learning from you about dispossession and displacement in another context, is that I think we must think both about the specificity and the connectivity between the particulars of these communities and their relation to a global totality. So thank you very much for inviting me to think alongside you in this shared project.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are loads of applause going on right now. And if we were in person, there certainly would be. Thank you. Now moving on to our next speaker. Next up, we have Dirk Moses. Dr. Moses has been the Frank Porter Graham Distinguished Professor of Global Human Rights History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill since July 2020. Raised in Brisbane, Australia, he was educated at the Universities of Queensland, St. Andrews, Notre Dame, and the University of California, Berkeley. From 2000 to 2010 and 2016 to 2020, he taught at the University of Sydney. And in the interim there, between 2011 and 2015, he held the chair of Global and Colonial History at the European University Institute in Florence. Moses's work has examined genocide and global history in a broad range of contexts. Recent anthologies include Post-Colonial Conflict and the Question of Genocide, the Nigeria-Biafra War, the Holocaust in Greece, and Decolonization, Self-Determination, and the Rise of Global Human Rights Politics. His most recent book, The Problems of Genocide, Permanent Security, and the Language of Transgression, came out in 2021 with Cambridge University Press. In it, Dr. Moses he combines an examination of the concept of genocide as the crime of crimes alongside the emergence of a state of permanent security to argue that focus upon genocide can distract us from myriad forms of violence like indiscriminate bombing and collateral damage by missile and drone strikes. His work has been supported by the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and many others. Today, he will give a talk entitled Settlers and Security, Structures and Subjectivity in State Formation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dirk Moses.
Thanks very much for the generous introduction, and of course to Melanie and Helen for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, even though I seem to resemble Robert in many ways, another middle-aged bald guy. Though my jacket's green and his is grey. This is how you distinguish us. The accents are slightly different. It is a great pity that we can't be together in person. We all know the reasons why, and we look forward to the next opportunity when we can discuss these things in person. We all miss the energy of in-person meetings and the intellectual transactions that take place in the corridors, at the pub afterwards and so forth. Now I have to confess perplexion when writing this paper. The role of the keynote is to survey and integrate fields, interpret our current moment, translate idiom into theoretical conceptual registers, to tie together conceptual strands with a neat bow on top. It is no less than to arrive at a meta-discourse, atop Mount Olympus, whence that universal perspective is possible, from which all others can be made sense of in their particularity. In other words, it's to perform and display mastery, giving the audiences the satisfaction that all is well in the academy, at least. For yes, we do have the means to understand the world we tell ourselves, so that after the discussion, we can repair to the pub or to dinner to ponder the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Increasingly, though, I'm finding this imperative less Sisyphean than hubristic, even an expression of toxic masculinity in its illusion of ultimate control over the wildly varied material we all confront. Now, I'm more aware than ever, or at least for me, that the point of mastery is receding in ever further into the distance. Instead of finding or devising solutions, I see limits, problems, and dilemmas. And I hope what I have to say now is useful nonetheless, because without confronting those limits, problems, and dilemmas, if they exist as I discern them, then we will be shadow boxing and talking past one another. This paper then won't end with a satisfying resolution, then with a gnawing feeling, at least for me, that we remain on the plains with incomplete maps rather than having scaled the peak of Mount Olympus. So how then did I arrive at this chastened conclusion? Allow me to sketch out the points of perplexion in turn, where my illusions of certainty have been destabilized recently. As we'll see, they pertain to our workshop's themes, Dispossession, and its legacies in comparative, intersectional, and connective context. And they concern those 5 S words in my alliterative title. And I do so in some humility, though, as I'm not an expert on Ottoman or Armenian history, merely a generalist making some observations. Now, let me share the screen so you can look at my PowerPoint. Okay. Consider this slide. The Armenian genocide claim as an imperialist lie. I'm presuming everyone can hear me, right? Okay, good. I was just checking the chat. The Armenian genocide is an imperialist lie. It emanates from a long-standing Turkish and earlier Ottoman view that regarded Armenians and other Christian subjects more generally as a disloyal minority that made themselves willing tools of the empire's enemies, especially the Russians, but also the French and the British, by seeking autonomy in 6 eastern provinces, although they were a minority there, even if a large one. The nationalists who designed and produced these outlandish posters see Turks as indigenous to the region, who mounted a heroic national liberation movement against the Allied occupation after the First World War, against the Treaty of Sèvres that partitioned the empire and gave key territory to a greater Armenia, key Turkish territory, that reinstituted the humiliating capitulations, and that enabled the Greek invasion with its massacres, and that relegated the Trump Turkish state to a second-rung status in the hierarchy of imperial powers. The ubiquitous statues and images of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who led this resistance, attest to the intensity of this belief, which is, in a way, anti-imperial in modality. That it is itself imperial and colonial, that is, this anti-imperial self-understanding, is difficult for these nationalists to see, but perhaps easier for others. Consider the author of the article here, a Turkish chap, who supports China by denying its brutal treatment of fellow Turkic Muslims, Uyghurs. He invokes classic Orientalist tropes about backwards peoples requiring uplift, which is itself a venerable Ottoman tradition. And he ignores the internal colonialism of the Chinese state that's been noted now by many experts of Xinjiang, who some of them talk about settler colonialism within China's borders. One might call this the anti-imperialism of fools. But does this mean there's an anti-imperialism of the wise, a sure ground for intellectual and moral orientation, political orientation? I'm no longer so sure. If one's normative ground is civilian protection and anti-racism. For the cry of national liberation that inspired the Christian peoples of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century was so often accompanied by ethnic cleansing and wholesale massacre. The Greek revolutionaries of the 1820s expelled and murdered Muslims and Jews in the land they sought to liberate. The millions of Muslims who fled or were expelled from the Caucasus and the Balkans into the Ottoman core territories in serial national liberations and Russian southward expansion is well known among specialists, but really brought into the analytical frame with the Armenian genocide, which may be seen as a concentrated act of revenge and retribution by ultra-nationalists seeking permanent security against the great powers, which were all empire states after all, during the First World War. In this regard, I was very glad to see my fellow North Carolinian, Ella Fratton-Turno, on the program. For 3 years ago, I published her splendid article, Producing Ottomans, Internal Colonization and Social Engineering in Ottoman Immigrant Settlement, in the Journal of Genocide Research, which I edit. I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, Ella, in briefly sharing your point about how Ottoman authorities participated in the global settler revolution in the 19th century by seeking settlers to cultivate underpopulated and possibly cultivatable territory, just like in North America and Australia, inviting anyone, including European, who could make the land more productive. However, after the Eastern crisis in the 1870s, when so many more European Muslims streamed into the south and eastwards into the core Ottoman lands with the expansion and foundation of new Christian Balkan states, Ottoman authorities utilized them for security rather than just cultivation purposes, to settle them by railway lines and to dilute denser Armenian populations. Of course, they were not alone in making such security calculations. So did the adjacent Russian Empire, and as did others. The point is that anti-imperialism is not necessarily a sure ground for politics and thinking, at least not in this region. Neither is indigeneity. In the name of this ideal, Israel has effaced its territory of many Palestinian villages, hundreds. The ruins of those that remain are then ascribed to the indigenous ancient Israelites who supposedly founded these settlements. Here's an example of one I visited in 2007, though these images are taken from the Jewish National Fund website. Looking at the slide on the left, you'll see how it describes it, and then halfway through it says, these terraces serve as a reminder of an almost vanished Hebrew culture dating back thousands of years. There's no mention of the Palestinians who lived there. And then in the next slide on the right, which is on the same page, but I've sort of stuck together on this PowerPoint, you'll see the coy mention of the Palestinian presence there at the end by saying that the place was abandoned by the Arabs in the late 1940s, but it's just a footnote in a larger indigenous presence, which is Jewish. In this regard, just last week, we learned the news that Azerbaijan would replace Armenian inscriptions on the remnants of ancient Armenian buildings with that of alleged Caucasian Albanians. The destruction and willful neglect of such heritage in Turkey is of course, well known. On this logic, both in historic Palestine and historic Armenia, Palestinian Arabs and Armenians are classed as the invading settlers, whose legacy needs to be uprooted and reversed. Which brings me to the question of whether we can escape the identity and conceptual traps of imagining homelands. As the anthropologist Lisa Malki has observed, homeland is invested with ontological significance, as in the phrases like, the land rose in rebellion, or in the belief that about the sacredness of national soil, thereby naturalizing the relationship between people and land. Botanical metaphors commonly express this link, suggested by the language of uprooting from native lands in which people live. Nationality thus constructs refugees as displaced from their indigenous settings. Ubiquitous familial terms also gesture to the tribal imaginary of nationalists. The image of a family of nations, so central in the liberal nationalism of Giuseppe Mazzini in the 19th century, echoes this nation. Together they posit what Sankara Krishna calls divine cartographies that neatly map peoples as naturally placed in their homelands, dangerously effacing their heterogeneity and overlapping borders that obtain in the real world. The drama of the geo-body can thus endure for millennia. Consequently, fantasized co-nationals are imagined as stranded in historically indigenous territories, temporarily occupied by aliens, even if for thousands of years. On the basis of these assumptions, the occupier can also imagine themselves as potential hostages, objects of possible reprisal for perceived mistreatment of their own nationals, likewise stranded across the border. Permanent security entailed a nation being housed in its state, the consonants of a cultural and political nation. Are these constructions of primordial consciousness of emplacement and group belonging and collective fate possible to escape? Can politics be imagined without them? I am trying, but we have to face up to the fact that Habermas's notion of a constitutional patriotism may be too thin an identity for many. Now, I don't need to play the political theorist here because I'm not a political theorist. We're talking about, in this conference, an interdisciplinary scholarly analysis of the past and present. In that regard, what I thought was solid melts into air when considering settler colonial studies, which I've dabbled in myself. fashionable for about a decade now, has been the subject to increasing critique by scholars in Indigenous and Native studies, both in this country and in Australia, for a variety of reasons. For seemingly suggesting that Indigenous people are fated to disappear by settler colonialism's inexorable logic of elimination, which is an enduring structure rather than a punctual invasive event, thereby effacing Indigenous agency and resistance. For its inability to appreciate Indigenous accommodations with settlers, which are always coded as an inauthentic assimilation or integration rather than an Indigenous modernity. For presuming that settler colonial pressure exhausts the totality of Indigenous existence. And finally, for dominating citations, footnotes, at the expense of Indigenous scholars. For example, Patrick Wolf's 2006 essay in the Journal of Genocide Research on settler colonialism and the elimination of the native, which I am proud to have solicited and published, has been downloaded about 250,000 times and over 88,000 times last year alone. Now, many of these criticisms are based, I think, on misunderstandings of Wolf's and Lorenzo Veracini's positions. But a telling criticism, I think, is that their austere structuralism in their elaboration, with its rigid binary between settler and colonist, which for them replaces the proletariat and the bourgeoisie as the primal scene of capitalism's primitive accumulation, which occurs outside Europe as its engine room rather than in the 18th century commons in England. That this rigid binary is inaccurate empirically. Consider Elena's new book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. That reconstructs the journey of Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations, known as the Five Tribes, from around Mississippi to the Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, in the mid-19th century. In doing so, because they were expelled from these land, they not only displaced the nations living in Oklahoma, but they brought with them enslaved Africans and continued a slave economy there. Now, not that Roberts eschews the settler colonial approach, she adapts it or complicates it by unmooring it from race. Because not only Europeans were settlers, so were Native Americans in such circumstances, even if they were unwilling, having been moved on to clear the land for Western settlers. But the slaves themselves, the enslaved Africans themselves, were structurally settlers, even more unwilling ones. In various publications, our colleague Keith Wattenpaugh, who we'll hear from tomorrow, but unfortunately can't be with us this evening, has analysed how Armenian refugees from the genocide were used by the French mandatory authorities as useful settlers against Syrian nationalists in Damascus. Now, the realization of this identity porousness or instability also became apparent to Kate Brown in her haunting book about Soviet deportations in the 1930s. This book here on the right, The Diary of No Place. Consider her statement about her own realization when following her subjects from the Ukraine to Kazakhstan. I thought I had come to record a story of displacement, of how people retained their national identities. So he's talking about Germans, ethnic Germans, Jews, and others, through the pain of deportation and how they held on to those identities in isolated settlement. But instead, I came across a far more complicated story, many stories, in fact, about how deportees were transformed into mostly willing colonizers of the Kazakh steppe as they took up a stake in the Soviet modernizing project, which had ejected indigenous Kazakh nomads from their ancestral land and way of life, filed them into reservation-like collector farms, and transformed the steppe into commodified industrial terrain. Now, of course, a settler colonial polity is not an empire. The latter do not strive to replace the indigenous with settlers, it is said. Empires are heterogeneous formations that allow difference, however hierarchical, and local autonomy, distinct religious courts, millets, and so on. And of course we know that under certain circumstances, like the geopolitical pressures and security anxieties I mentioned already, imperial states do engage in virtually zero-sum settler projects in their border regions. Donald Bloxham has written about them in this book on the right, and in another book I edited, showing how the coexistence between Christians and Muslims that Nick Demanis reconstructs in this book on the left, which is unfortunately underappreciated, is rendered unviable, and how this delicate tissue of common life unravels under this pressure. Still, the settler colonial lens does not quite work as well in other ways. Armenians could not be racialized as civilizationally inferior with those indeterminate property rights we just heard about, like indigenous people in the British Empire. If anything, Ottoman authorities were worried about their mercantile prowess and modern connections abroad, at least in urban areas. Likewise, the agency issue was paramount, as is contingency, which the seeming inevitability of elimination in settler colonialism's logic seems to forecast. Sometimes it seems as if the Armenian genocide is set in motion decades before in the onward march of Ottoman intolerance, with terrible massacres in the 1890s and in 1909. We know, though, that Armenian leaders welcomed the 1908 coup and, with the reinstituted constitution, foresaw a future within the empire, with an Ottomanism that bound the empire's varied subjects while recognizing their difference. This was also the ideal that animated Palestinian Arab and Jewish communities at the same time, as much recent research is demonstrating about the region before Zionism became a real presence. And as Laurie Allen has noted recently, this is a chapter in the Routledge Handbook of the League of Nations Mandates in the Middle East. This image remained in an updated form, the Palestinian ideal, well into the 1920s, as an alternative to the settler colonial logic of the Balfour Declaration. Allow me to share her words directly here rather than imperfectly summarize them, right? What could ensure justice in a future Arab government was a civil democratic kingdom, which was the demand for the majority of those with whom the commission, the King Commission, talked. Equal status for religious minorities featured centrally in the Arab petition's articulation of a just, independent state. Since the Jews, who are about 10% of the population, we shouldn't forget, like the Christians, who are also about 10%, 80% were Arab Muslims, were a religious minority, they would be considered citizens like all others. So as you can see, this is an updated version of that Ottomanism, because you're a citizen now rather than a subject. Now, it's actually a bit tricky for me to read all this out, but I'll just leave it there for the time being. Now, I am sure that such sentiments as these ring hollow to Armenian ears now as they would have then, that is in the 1920s after the genocide. But what about 1908 with an open future? Hard as it is to imagine, one can envisage a past without the genocide, dispossession and its legacies, and now a future without genocide, dispossession and its legacies. What kind of present should be striven for? Is that one in which what political scientists call ontological security, safeguarding a nation's memory regime, is driven by such a political imagination policy of seeking ontological security? Now, a drive of Armenian ontological security is having the world and the Turkish state recognize the crimes against the Armenians during the First World War as genocide. I am wondering now whether the genocide concept and Holocaust memory, which is related, whose advocates I've long been until now, are so useful anymore in such imaginings. I know this is taboo territory, but here we go. Here's why, right? The official Turkish rejection of the genocide claim is that the empire faced an existential crisis in the simultaneous invasion and internal Armenian rebellion, leading the authorities to deport Christian civilians from the conflict zones and repress the Armenian uprising. Now, this framing of events dates from the war itself. In these circumstances of emergency, so the apologetic narrative goes, it was regrettable that many Armenian civilians perished, but so then did many Muslims. Here was a neat and convenient symmetry of suffering, the civil war rather than genocide argument in which two roughly equal sides were pitched against one another. Quote, the totality of evidence thus far by historians tells a grim story of serious intercommunal conflict perpetrated both by Christian and Muslim irregular forces, complicated by disease, famine, and many other of war's privations. So declares the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it continues, the evidence does not describe genocide. What's more, continues the diplomatic statement, quote, the Armenians took arms against their own government. Their violent political aims, not their race, ethnicity, or religion, rendered them subject to relocation. Now, adding a layer to this apologetic arsenal, a Turkish diplomat in Israel told a newspaper readers there, that the Holocaust could be distinguished from the events of 1915 by the fact of Armenian agency. Quote, Armenian forces gearing up for a nation state of their own in Eastern Anatolia, where they constituted minority of the population, were leading the Russian troops and attacking the supply lines of the Turkish army. So the Ottoman Empire decided to apply relocation, end of quote. Although this reasoning vastly inflates Armenian military agency into fantastical proportions, it's an article of faith in Turkey. The Turkish writer Ayşe Kulin follows this line of argumentation when she rejected the genocide label for the Armenian case. For although liking Armenians very much, she says, she continued that the deportations had occurred during the war, which meant that they can't be genocide. She also sought to mitigate her frank admission of the killing by pointing to Armenian provocation, a political factor one did not find in the Holocaust, she said, and I quote her. This is a really revealing quotation. We did not butcher the Armenians without a reason, end quote. Even then, she continued, there was no systematic extermination as in Auschwitz. Quote, Turks did not do anything to them like the Germans did to the Jews. Similarly, using the Holocaust as an archetype for genocide, the Turkish journalist Mustafa Akyol opined that ethnic cleansing or deportation rather than genocide had occurred because, quote, the Ottoman government only pushed Armenians out of Anatolia, whereas the Nazis searched for Jews everywhere in order to exterminate them one by one, end of quote. The historian Bernard Lewis repeated this commonplace in agreeing that the German persecution was not regional and partial, but continental, and named it total annihilation. He added that the Holocaust was, quote, a different matter from the Armenian case because, quote, there was no rebellion, armed or otherwise. German Jews, by contrast, were intensely loyal and were attacked wholly and solely by their alleged racial identity. Now, this invocation of the Holocaust to discount the Armenian campaign for genocide recognition pervades the discussion. It has roots in a broader Turkish endeavor to join the international club of so-called civilized states that promote Holocaust memory and research by burnishing the country's credentials for supposedly rescuing Jews during the Holocaust. Far from increasing consciousness of genocide in the past, this diplomatic project revives an Ottoman legacy of multinational cohabitation. It thereby dismisses the Armenian and Kurdish positions for disrupting the harmonious empire a year ago with their noisy and disloyal particularism, just as they threaten Turkey today with their mischievous genocide accusations to advance revisionist and secessionist agendas. Yes, in writing this, I realize that I'm undercutting my earlier sympathetic reading of Laurie Allen's depiction of Arab Ottomanism in the first decades of the 20th century. And this is what I mean by my inability to scale Mount Olympus. Do we find redemption in memory, as is so often said and as I learned in graduate school in the 1990s? I'm not so sure either when considering how the Holocaust described sacral aura operates to exculpate states like the Turkish one. For its status makes it impossible for state leaders to conceive that genocide occurred in their history or was committed by their co-religionists. In 1997, Turkey's ambassador to the US suggested that the Armenian genocide accusation implied it was a precedent for Hitler and thus, quote, very injurious to the psyche of the Turkish people. And 10 years later, the Turkish president Erdogan dismissed criticisms for hosting the then Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir, who was indicted by the ICC for genocide, with the words that, quote, no Muslim could perpetrate the genocide, but Muslims could be its victims. Thus, Erdogan proclaimed Rohingyas of Myanmar to be victims of genocide, although their treatment closely resembles the Ottoman treatment of Armenians. Turkey was at the forefront of genocide prevention, insisted Mehmet Ali Sahin, the Speaker of the Turkish Grand National Assembly, on the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust in 2011. Throughout history, he said, our nation has adopted a principled and peaceful approach which cares for the oppressed peoples, while sharply rejecting all kinds of persecution, injustice, and oppression against humanity. The accompanying Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs press statement declares that the Holocaust is the gravest crime against humanity in history, and it committed Turkey to the lessons of, quote, protecting and promoting democracy and human rights and combating racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. What else could measure up to the greatest crime in history, they were saying? Plainly, genocide could not be part of this glorious past. It was occurring elsewhere. Attacking Turkish Kurds in military campaigns in 2015 and 16 was thus undertaken with a clean conscience, because it was driven by security, it said, and not by racial antipathy. The Turkish position also mirrors Israeli foreign policy that also seeks to make the Holocaust the ultimate threshold of transgression, one that consciously excludes the Armenian genocide by conflating the Holocaust and genocide. Thus, the former Israeli Foreign Minister, Shimon Peres, stated that, quote, we reject attempts to create a similarity between the Holocaust and the Armenian allegations. What the Armenians went through is a tragedy, but not a genocide. As if singing from the same song sheet, the Turkish ambassador to the US told readers of the Washington Post that calling the events of 1915 a genocide, quote, dilutes the moral force that recollections of the Holocaust should generate for us all. Another consequence of investing the Holocaust and genocide with special moral force is the effort of prominent Armenian historians to shoehorn the Armenian experience into the Holocaust paradigm. In other words, to redact the Armenian experience leading up to and during the First World War so it resembles the Jewish experience leading up to and during the Second World War, with its hapless civilians murdered simply for who they are, innocent victims of racist policy evacuated of political context. Muslim anti-Armenian sentiment comes to resemble anti-Semitism, and the genocide is seen as the outcome of decades, if not centuries, of ever-intensifying ethnic hatred in the name of Turkish ethnic purity. Rather than casting the First World War in the name, as the context in which ethnic difference became fatally politicized, it's merely a pretext for a carefully nurtured intention to kill off the Armenian minority, whose aspirations for independent statehood are unquestionably legitimate, whatever its implications for the Turkish homeland and for the Turks living in that territory. What's more, such accounts emphasize the agentlessness of Armenians. For the more passive the victims, the less likely they can be found guilty of treason, as the Turkish case accuses. If Armenians were politically and militarily active, so the reasoning goes, they cannot have been passive victims of genocide, because the Ottoman state would have been guided by legitimate considerations of military necessity. In this way, treating genocide as a non-political hate crime blinds us and politically and legally ties our hands when faced with mass criminality that contains political dimensions. It obscures the reality that all such criminality, in my view, is saturated with political logics. So let me conclude. Where does this leave us? Well, I've not said anything about the aesthetic dimensions mentioned in the workshop abstract, because I'm not a literature scholar nor a cultural studies scholar. It's the politics that interests me. Now, Armenia and Azerbaijan are not the only post-imperial states in the news. So, as usual, is Israel and Palestine, with the release of the Amnesty International report on apartheid in all territories under Israeli control, from the river to the sea. Now, without getting into its merits, it reminds us again, if needed, that the partitionist logic of the Oslo Accords and the so-called two-state solution is long dead and buried. A viable Palestinian state is impossible, which is, of course, the idea of Israeli policy and practice. As a consequence now, Many are speaking of a decolonial vision that once again squares the circle of unity and difference by proposing a binational future in which no one is in charge, in which the dangerous and utopian dream of permanent security is relinquished. Now, this is not quite a neo-Ottomanism with its hierarchies, for it sublates and incorporates national consciousness into a larger unity, although no one can really imagine how that would work at the moment, but there's lots being written about it. Of course, relinquishing power, and thus the illusion of security, is difficult to countenance. For control in history is a lesson that abused minorities have learned as the lesson of empire's own security, paranoias, and fantasies. Instead, so far, the Amnesty report has triggered accusations of anti-Semitism and exterminationist fears of a renewed genocide of Jews in the form of equal rights for everyone and the return of refugees. I observed a repetition of such fears as well in the recent military conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They are understandable, but do they help us understand the past, present, and future? I think that's a conversation worth having. Thanks very much.
All right, perfect. So I will now jump in and invite Robert and Dirk into a Q&A session and thinking and reflecting on your keynotes. For the audience, please go ahead and put your questions using the Q&A feature. You guys in the audience won't see this, but several of our panelists from tomorrow are also present and kind of backstage for us. So panelists, you are welcome to raise your hand. I can see you, and I'll also be able to kind of raise your questions while also fielding questions from the audience. So please go ahead and submit them as they come in. I'll look at them, and I want to get tonight's conversation going and kind of preparing us for tomorrow. We asked you, Robert and Dirk, knowing you guys had various kind of expertise, and not necessarily or not exclusively or anyway of an Armenian Ottoman studies, but we wanted to think about the framework of dispossession and to kind of give us a way to build dialogue across disciplines and also across contexts. So I'm going to open the Q&A by asking you guys to reflect. Dirk, you kind of did this, I think, in your talk, and having us think through the multiplicity or the different categorizations of the figure of the settler as we think through and theorize in different contexts. So I'm going to reframe that and ask you both to say that there's incredible kind of utility to the rubric of dispossession. And so I want to ask you guys to reflect, does the rubric of dispossession ever reach its limits for you? Which is to say, put it differently, does the invocation of the rubric of dispossession also bear with it a responsibility to particularize and name difference? So name difference in terms of modes of dispossession, in terms of mechanisms through which dispossession is achieved, and in terms of localities. So I'll have you guys think through that, but in the spirit of building dialogue and in the spirit of having your guys' work transit with our work in Ottoman and Armenian studies, and kind of as a preview of making connections tomorrow, I will ground why I'm getting to that question by kind of making connections. So Robert, in your work in Theft is Property, you kind of get to that when you say dispossession as a concept can be mobilized, but it can raise a number of tensions. If we think about the entanglements, if we think about the different positions of communities and their different histories. It's interesting in the ways that you think through and name dispossession, certainly land in terms of the logic of settler colonization and territorial acquisition. You also think about it in terms of the legal and the legality. So we can think about the treaty system, and we can certainly think about federal Indian policy. You also speak about dispossession in terms of labor, and this is where you especially refer to Black radical tradition of dispossession thought through the body more often than to land, as you would characterize it and as you put it in Theft is Property. I want to have that kind of transit, Dirk, with what you have to say, and not necessarily tonight, but I think in your larger body of scholarship, because there are several people in our audience tonight whose work I think is naming or thinking through dispossession, without necessarily naming it. And Dirk, I'm going to maybe have you think through this in terms of cultural genocide. And I know in your most recent work, you kind of push against the kind of teleological rendering understanding of the concept of genocide. But that'll be really useful to us as we think through dispossession in Armenian studies and Ottoman studies. And I have a couple of folks in particular that I'm thinking of. So certainly I'm thinking of Hernár Zétlián Wattenpau in The Missing Pages, and the ways in which, in describing the ways that the canon tables from the Zaytun Gospels are removed from their mother manuscript, and as she is theorizing, giving us this framework of survivor objects, at one point Hernár refers to the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And so Hernár, you haven't thought of this, but I certainly would love to see you one day write this paper, is to really think about what connection and comparison might do in terms of from, let's say, an Armenian context to this kind of larger route, larger leaps that we can make. And here we might connect it to what we receive in the codification of genocide as a concept, as a term, and what Dirk, as you think through and say, is kind of missing, and that is a cultural aspect. So how do these kind of, the dispossession through material and immaterial culture is pointing to these larger histories of genocide, and especially cultural genocide, that perhaps dispossession isn't actually articulated for various reasons. In your work, you think about this in terms of settler colonial states and the decision not to adopt the cultural aspect, because in part it would mean accountability to Indigenous peoples and dispossession. Certainly we can think about the work of Banu Karaka, who also in the work Art, Dispossession, and the Economies of Forgetting in Turkey, writes that the silences pervade Turkey's artificial memory regime. Those silences are mirrored in the blind spots of national art history. There's a particularly fascinating section there called, in that article, the topographies of dispossession. Now, to heed kind of, Dirk, what you were saying earlier, the critiques of settler colonial studies from Indigenous studies and Native studies scholars, I don't want to lose sight of Indigenous studies scholars' work. And as a scholar who's interested in literary studies, I want to kind of build those connections and think about these other means of dispossession. So in Solar Storms, a novel by Linda Hogan, dispossession is completed through, in the context of Canada, and completed and enacted through state-sponsored damming project of rivers. So here, we're not just speaking of land or labor, we're also speaking in terms of water, and water that is mobilized and perhaps weaponized. Certainly we saw that in the context of No Dapple. We also, I think in Armenian studies and Ottoman studies, think about this in terms of language. Now, I'll come at this from a kind of comparative perspective. So here I have in mind Lele Long Soldier's poetry collection, Whereas, and especially the rendering of that poem, the long poem, Whereas. And specifically, Lele is revisiting the 2009 Congressional Resolution of Apology to Native Americans, which was folded into this kind of unrelated piece of legislation, the 2010 Defense Appropriations Act. And of course, there's sound critique of that. There's sound critique of this notion of apology and sound critique of what that document does. Because the whereas ends up producing the document to say, no, there's no claim against the US or settlement of claims against the US that can be mobilized through the document itself. So here language becomes a means of dispossession, and here language becomes a means in the creative form to articulate a larger history of language through law. Certainly in the Armenian context, I think this will come out with Ella's work and Mehmet's work. We can think about the language of the abandoned property laws, the redistribution of property, and here again, the legal mechanisms. For a kind of more broader sense, beyond kind of the legalistic use of language, we can think of the work of course, Taler Shahinian, who is thinking through Western Armenian language and categorizing it as stateless. We can also think of there's a recent translation of the work of Krikor Beledian, and the translation of it in English, the particular portion is translated, the title is Unpeopled Language. So we can think about people and language in that relationship, and perhaps the state and the dispossession and lack of access to language. Now, we won't unfortunately be able to have Rugen tomorrow in our roundtable, and Rugen doesn't work in the context of language, but we can take inspiration from the work of Rugen Şengül, and as she thinks through the Kurdish context, and we might perhaps bring in conversation and think about language and dispossession, lack of access to language in terms of also Kurdish language and the kind of cultural expression that's banned by the Turkish state. And there's a really fascinating article here from Rayana Ghazarian about the ways in which Radio Yerevan actually played Kurdish music and allowed kind of access to what was otherwise prevented. So I come at you with that question again of, does the rubric of dispossession, as it travels in these different contexts, do you see yourself butting up against and reaching its limits? And how do you work through that? Because we have body, we have land, we have water, we have stories, memories, language, a lot. legalistic, all of these kind of modes and mechanisms through which dispossession is realized. So I know it's kind of larger, but it will ground us tomorrow in our workshop as we kind of think through these kind of different connections, these juxtapositions, and these differences. So hearing from you about how you encounter those limitations and perhaps work through them, I think will be really useful for us.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I should go
That's
first.
you, Robert. Yes, Robert, this is all for you. Every one of those questions is for you.
Well, I won't be able to bite off a tenth of that. That was wonderful, synthetic kind of comments and reactions. That was really helpful. And you really like pointed out all of the different kinds of ways in which we can take these conversations. And it'll certainly take at least the next day or so to think through the different kinds of permutations. Let me just try to make a few really brief, hopefully brief general remarks, both responding to some of what Dirk had to say and then also some of the questions. So the first and most obvious thing is to say that I'm methodologically taking up these questions very differently than Dirk is, and very differently than some of you. You know, I'm probably from your standpoint, I'm flying 30,000 feet above the air in a very abstract, because I'm really interested in the bigger conceptual and even sort of semantic questions, right? Because, so I'm not, one thing that I want to emphasize is that I'm not per se advocating the use of the terminology of dispossession as if to say what happened here is dispossession. I'm interested in, as I said, historicizing why what happened came eventually to be called dispossession. What is the process by which a set of historical processes come to be understood in one framework versus another? And part of the point is that the fact that it comes to be called dispossession is itself symptomatic of some feature of the process, specifically the way in which a kind of proprietary grammar or logic vocabulary comes to seep into the broader legal and political struggles, so much so that to resist them appears to require drawing upon the very vocabulary that they're trying to resist. And so it's that process that I'm, in a sense, trying to analyze, not so much that this, to declare by fiat that this was an instance of dispossession, but to study how it is and why it is that people come to describe a thing as dispossession. And so you asked a little bit about what is the limits then of thinking about it in that way versus another way, right? And that's, I think that's exactly how we need to think about these things, is not so much what is the right vocabulary. Is this an instance of settler colonialism, or is it an instance of imperialism, or is it an instance of genocide, or is it an instance of displacement or dispossession? The question is, what is the comparative difference it makes to avail oneself of a certain sort of vocabulary? What comparative cases does it invoke? When you start to talk about, for instance, the Ottoman Empire as an instance of settler colonials, it immediately invokes a set of comparative cases, which are very different than if one talks about apartheid, or if one talks about genocide, or if one talks about displacement and dispossession and removal. So I think the question is, what comparative difference does it make? Now, I think in my head, two big things are light to the fore when I think about using the comparative value of using the concept of dispossession. The first is that the focus then becomes on the processes rather than on identities. So this is a little bit, I think, what Dirk was talking about in terms of the criticism of the relatively trans-historical or ahistoricized conceptions of settler and native. That rather than thinking about settlers and natives, or who is indigenous and who is not indigenous, if we think about who is dominated and who is not dominated, who suffers a condition of exploitation, who suffers a condition of displacement, and so on, that the question of dispossession then focuses on a process rather than on an ahistorical set of identity categories. And I think that that's one thing that helps us to dislodge away from some of the concerns that were rightly raised with regard to some of those more kind of structural trans-historical ways in which settler-native binaries were deployed. But more specifically then, when we're talking about, if we focus on dispossession as the sort of process under description, what is added by that. And that's what I am trying to highlight by the fact that it clearly, to me, foregrounds the language of possession and property. And it demonstrates the extent to which that kind of thinking seeps into even movements that are organized in the resistance to it. So in the context of the cases that I'm most familiar with, it entails a shift from thinking about indigenous peoples as mobilizing in defense of the land because they had some pre-colonial cultural or even ontological attachment to land, and shifts it into thinking that indigenous peoples mobilize in defense of land because that is the particular form of domination that they experience. They were targeted for the sake of land acquisition, and thus it makes sense as a kind of dialectical reversal of that targeting process that they mobilize as land defenders, right? Which isn't to say that there aren't pre-colonial cultural and epistemological kinds of resources to draw upon, but those resources get politicized in a new way as peoples come to respond to a particular form of domination. And I think that that's part of what I'm trying to highlight in foregrounding the language of dispossession, is not just this was a process which is distinct from, say, exploitation, but that it is a process which helps us understand the politicization of the concept of indigeneity and why it comes to be so strongly connected to concepts of land. That connection is forged in a particular history of resistance. If we foreground that, then we can also, I think, hopefully avoid some of the problems which Dirk was mentioning, which is that the misappropriation and when that travels outside of its context, people who also avail themselves of a so-called primordial or time ahistorical connection to land, but not as a form of resistance against domination, but precisely in order to dominate others. And that's the thing that we, of course, need to foreground is what is the function of this rather than what is it in a sort of ahistorical way, if that makes sense. So those are my sort of initial thoughts.
No, I think they're really useful in a couple of different ways. I think as we move into tomorrow, and I think for us, and whether that's in the audience or for our panelists as we work through, it will be in essence, you're showing us that these concepts, as you, let's say, the vocabulary, and as you're able to draw out and show us where they come from, how they're used, and into what end, have genealogies. And so as we move into tomorrow, as we kind of build conversation, we will, I think, constantly be thinking about what are the genealogies of these concepts, and in what case do we not just kind of one-to-one co-opt or flatten, but acknowledge the genealogies while still making meaning and thinking and maybe contributing through larger kind of theoretical discourses. This would be great. There's, I think, a question from Ron Suni, which is related to what you're saying, Robert. So I'll raise it now. And Ron Suni asks, can one argue, and this is in the Q&A, you can see it, can one argue that if the land belongs to no one, it belongs to everyone, and it is alienated by those, like settlers, who claim it as their property? And also, what about the idea of the commons, which is somewhat related to an idea of land belonging to those who share property?
Sure. So that's another, of course, really big and thorny kind of nest. There are dispossession can also be, of course, usefully situated in relation to another set of proximate vocabularies that have run alongside it historically. One of those is the language of enclosures of the commons, right? Which is kind of both a Marxist vocabulary going all the way back to Capital and the last sections of Capital, but also the revival of that by people like E.B. Thompson and the Midnight Notes Collective, all the way up to Hart and Negri. And so there's this other vocabulary of enclosures of the commons, which is runs, as I said, sort of parallel alongside the questions of dispossession. I think one beneficial feature of that vocabulary is that it is a vocabulary that is spatial and allows us to think very much in terms of spatial terms, because enclosure is already a vocabulary that comes with it notions of encirclement and whatnot. But it's also a vocabulary that foregrounds the idea that there's a kind of collective inheritance of the earth as a whole, from which we have all been severed in our relationship to, through processes, for instance, of, in particular, I think, of capitalist privatization. That is, that it's a sort of seizure of a common set of resources through a process of privatization. I think the downside of the vocabulary of enclosures of the commons, which Indigenous scholars try to point out, is a similar kind of argument that the one I was just pointing to, is that when it becomes very transhistorical and ahistorical, it effaces the fact that while we humans may be severed from the commons through some kind of process of privatization, we are not done so evenly, that there's extremely asymmetrical relationships between peoples that are situated in the same process that is being described as a kind of enclosures of the commons. And so I think what Indigenous people are trying to do is, in a sense, like historicize a lot more what that means in particular contexts, and how specific communities of people, while we humans may be, you know, dissociated from our common inheritance of the earth, some humans in particular have been targeted in very specific ways and very violent ways, and that's kind of generic language of the commons and a return to commons, especially when it invokes a sort of open access for all peoples, irrespective of the historical kinds of configurations and legacies, that's a deeply kind of problematic way. I mean, there's lots of forms of colonization that have begun through a kind of blank slate. Well, everybody owns this because it's held in common by all. I mean, that's taken almost directly from Locke's second treatise. So I think, again, I would want to sort of historicize what is the function of an invocation about the commons, to what purposes is it being advanced, for whom, against whom, and to ask what is the power configurations that are enabled by such an invocation. And that, to me, would track us much closer to the kind of political economy of that terminology in any particular case.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to now turn it to Dr. Fatma Mojagocek, who's also here at the University of Michigan. So thank you for raising your hand and your question. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful, with these two wonderful presentations. And I was very interested in the fact that even though you sort of problematize dispossession, I would argue that you problematized it within the context of Western European modernity, and which is, of course, the basis of humanities, social sciences, and the like that we know. So what I'm trying to get is to a criticism at sort of a more meta-theoretical level, in the sense that you can, and this was sort of hinted to by Helen, who when she mentioned language, because language itself, possession itself, entails obviously something that we today visualize within the Western European context, in the sense that it does usually get correlated with property, with physicality, you know, and with law, of course, that very much then systematizes that relationship, and I'm talking Western law, so that, you know, our whole framework, in a way, is set even with the word possession itself, I mean, or dispossession, by bringing in this way of thinking. Why am I sort of questioning this? Because I'm trying to develop a theory of explaining things from the vantage point of minorities specifically. And in order to do that, how could we start? And can we start again with concepts like possession, dispossession, and the like, which I would argue come from the Western context, from the weaponization of knowledge, with the intent, of course, to colonize and possess, which is what the white settlers ended up doing. If we want to come up with an alternate way of approaching this, I think what we need to do is to first criticize our own vantage point as scholars, our own point of using these terms, and making sure that we are aware of the framework within which we're approaching it. And would it be possible then to engage with scholars on the other side, indigenous scholars, but you're only engaging with those scholars as they operate within the system itself, so that we approach them as they have been reduced to individuals, within property relations as such. I mean, in a way, then I would argue, how do we bring in the agency of the indigenous people? Because that probably is the way to sort of approach this. The problem is, how do we bring in that indigeneity in its own terms? I would argue that it wouldn't be enough, for example, to think of only the individual level, which is what sort of underlies it. I mean, in a way, I would go beyond commons and think about the level of the community. I mean, and then, I would also talk about, if you think about indigeneity, they did have a concept of body, mind, and spirit. Which sort of explain different conceptualizations. And possession, as we use it, I would argue only relates to the body. But what about the mind and the spirit? We're not able to bring those into our discussions. If that's the case, then do we have to go down to ontology from epistemology, which we're now conversing at, and maybe redefine the terms in a way that haven't been redefined? Raven Connell tried to do that, with respect to Southern theory. Can we then develop from indigeneity the terms that we ought to be using to discuss these concepts? And that, of course, also criticizes maybe the organizers and, and the way they also use these concepts. So this is a totally radical approach, and I wonder what you think about it. Thank you.
Do you want me to respond again? I'm not sure how, I don't want to. Yeah.
I don't do ontology, Robert. That's your territory.
So you're right to notice that what I am proposing is, in a sense, a form of an immanent critique. It begins within the vocabulary and framework that I sort of empirically observe around me, people drawing upon, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, and trying to work through how one can still leverage a critique kind of from within that framework, right? And you're suggesting that, well, why don't we just throw it out and start with something totally different that's a kind of alternative normative framework that dispenses altogether with that. So there are people doing that kind of work, right? And in my work, I try to engage with that, and I don't want to in any way be taken as sort of foreclosing the possibility of such a thing, of saying that that's sort of per se, wrong or impossible. I see what I'm doing as kind of partially complementary to other kinds of people who are themselves indigenous. I'm not indigenous. We're trying to work through and try to build up an alternative kind of framework of that sort. I do think I will make a plea for why I think what a kind of immanent critique of dispossession is not simply dispensable. It's not something that we can just sort of throw out for a couple of reasons. One is that the language of property is not just a language, right? It's a concrete set of institutions and practices that are. It's not something we just sort of pick up and put down. It permeates almost all of our legal and political vocabulary. So it becomes important then to, I think, to go work through a kind of immanent critique of that. And I think that is seen in movements. So I'm from Canada originally. In Canada, like the language of land theft is an extremely important vocabulary for Indigenous activists. And I don't want to criticize that per se, but I want to understand the source of that. Where does that come from? Why is that? And how has indigeneity become attached to that kind of vocabulary? So that's I think important. The other reason why it's important to still work through that kind of immanent critique and to complement a little bit what you're saying is that when we turn to this question of, okay, well, let's develop an alternative, a non-Western, non-European, indigenous kind of framework, we encounter other kinds of problems. It's not like that is going to immediately sort of resolve everything, because as Dirk was pointing out in his presentation, it's not as if the category of indigenous is itself self-evident. It becomes question begging to simply say, well, we'll ask indigenous peoples to speak from an indigenous perspective, because then immediately one must interrogate the parameters and politics surrounding the whole framework and concept of indigeneity. So then we just turn the whole question back, fold it back into the historical manifestations and politicizations of the concept of indigeneity, rather than pointing to it as a sort of self-evident thing that will help us get out of the problem of this immanent historical critique. So that's another, and people are doing that important work, but like I say, it doesn't exactly sort of get us it's no less entangled a set of concepts than property is. I don't think there's any easy way of slipping out of that trap, if you see what I mean. But I appreciate the point that there's other ways of taking up this kind of problem.
Okay, we have Matthew, I see your hand up. We have a question from you, and then I'll sort back. I can ask one more question, so I'll turn it over to you, Matthew.
Sure, thank you. And thank you both, Robert and Dirk, for wonderful addresses. My question touches on something that both of you mentioned in your talks. Let me lower my hand. I think in what you both spoke about, notions of transhistorical identities linked to certain territories and the relationship between those two. So collective identity and place. And it came up for Robert when you were discussing this notion of the earth doesn't belong to anybody, we belong to it, but then indigenous I don't even want to say activists, because anybody wronged by waves of dispossession in the past doesn't need to be an activist to do this, but the indigenous people invoking this have to still work through this language of dispossession, but it still hinges on a belonging to the earth. Dirk, it came out a little more saliently in what you were talking about, the sacredness of homeland and emplacement. But I do think across both of these that there's this sort of embedded within it, this notion of belonging to specific lands. And now, Robert, when you were talking in your answer previously, what I thought I heard you saying, and what I think I understand you to be saying, is that to some extent that this belonging is actually linked to past waves of dispossession. So why are questions of indigeneity today so linked to theft of land? Why this intense feeling of belongingness to the land? In part because you were dispossessed of the land, and so there's a longing for this thing that's been lost. Now, Dirk, you also mentioned these influxes of Muslim refugees into the Ottoman Empire, for example, in the lead up to the Armenian genocide, the expulsion of Greeks and the population exchange, and other waves of dispossession in Ottoman lands. So I guess the question I have is, to what extent are our current contemporary concepts of dispossession hitched to these notions of land and belonging? And the relationship between them. To what extent do we now live in a world where we have these seemingly never-ending chains of a past dispossession recalled today, which in some cases justifies to the minds of some a new wave of dispossession, which will in turn set into motion more claims of dispossession, which could in turn, and so on and so forth. I'd be curious to hear both of your thoughts on this, and I wonder if it is perhaps the space where, Dirk, you were expressing some humility in where to go next, we're not quite sure. But I'd be curious to hear what you have to say.
Sure. Shall I go first on this one?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, look, there are various kinds of claims that one can identify with dispossession. I mean, there is this philosophical question or discussion that Robert and Murjay are having, which I'm not going to get involved in. I'm just an historian looking at things empirically, but also the categories with which we do so, as an intellectual historian, rather than normatively. And so we can see different registers. We can see that there are formal legal claims made by people, whether Armenians, Indigenous people, Jews, and so forth. The issue of dispossession comes up in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem now, about who really owns those houses in which Palestinians are living. The Israeli courts are saying, actually they belong to other people, and that's being disputed. But there's then, and that's a brilliant case for the point I'm going to make now. There's a broader issue of metaphorical, but also political claim of dispossession, not about individual properties, but about eviction from a homeland. These evictions in East Jerusalem, also in Silwan, another part of East Jerusalem, are seen by Palestinians and others, including many human rights groups, as part of a broader pattern of dispossession, which is not illegal. The system of nation states in international law have blessed the dispossession, the dispossession of Palestinians and legalized it. We could get into the question of the inherited status of Palestinian refugees, but during the years of the military government in northern Israel until 1966, about half of Palestinian land was annexed or nationalized and taken off them. This is all perfectly legal in the Israeli system. And so legal claims are difficult to make there, but who's to say this is not dispossession in a broader sense? So I just think we need to be very specific about what we mean by dispossession in different cases. We know that there are now restitution claims by Armenians for what happened during the genocide today, okay? From America to some extent as well. So, and then these issues pertain to international borders, dispossession of homeland more generally. Yeah. So I just think we need to disaggregate these and be very specific about what we mean at a particular time. Now, just to answer your other question, yes, I am trying to break that, or pleading to break that chain of victimization and then becoming the reasons for perpetration as a way of making of revenge and retaliation or compensation. So against this cycle that you discerned that I was talking about in my paper. That's part of a broader project that I'm engaged in now on genocide and the terror of history. I'm interested in the way that memory entrepreneurs, those that claim to speak for a particular group, terrorize members of that group with stories of suffering in history. I won't name any particular group, but we have been oppressed by our neighbors, occupied, terrorized, murdered, our property taken, our women raped, etc., for centuries. And whenever there's an issue today, that's seen as a recurrence of that pattern. I call that the terror of history. I take that from a Romanian fascist thinker, Mircea Eliade, wrote a book about it, which is very perceptive because he was in a sense writing about his own fascist youth. And he's as a Romanian intellectual that was being threatened by Soviet Union and by the Ottomans beforehand and so forth. Small people stuck in the middle of Europe. So I'm very much interested in the political mentality of so-called small nations, where this is prevalent for obvious reasons. I mean, it's not an indictment. As an historian, I'm just interested in how and why these modalities of consciousness come into existence and how memory entrepreneurs mobilize them. Because what they do is they tend to catastrophize politics, which I am against, because catastrophe politics leads to what I call permanent security, which one of whose modalities is genocide.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that other than to say I agree very much with the basic point that one must study these in their specific empirical context, that instead of, so this is a kind of strange thing for me to say because it's a kind of anti-theory point, that the point isn't to sort of solve it at the level of a kind of theoretic, like that the formal structure of the argument can be gotten right or wrong in without reference to the function of the argument, the pragmatics of the speech act, rather than as opposed to sort of the content or semantic content of it. And but that cuts both ways, right? So it is both true that to understand what a particular claim is doing requires situating it in its sort of particular context, and so specificity around like what do people mean when they're using the word dispossession. And so I'm trying to think through in a particular context means keeping track of that kind of empirical and material effects of the claims making process. But the corollary of that, I think, is that we don't get paralyzed by the anticipatory problem, which does come up a lot once people start thinking in these, rightly, in these very concrete ways. And by that I mean that every particular emancipatory struggle has the potential to be converted into a form of domination through the co-optation of the form of the argument in a totally different context, in a totally different power situation, right? And so we know that in advance. So we can't get paralyzed, I think, by knowing that, well, in the Haudenosaunee in North America make claims to a sort of ancestral homeland, and in some totally other context, centuries before or after in Europe, someone made a sort of formalistically similar argument in favor that was deployed for fascistic purposes. Therefore, we must invalidate the Haudenosaunee. That the latter claim doesn't follow from the observation that formally those arguments, yes, echo one another, but they're substantively quite different because they exist in completely different political contexts. And that's what I mean by sort of keeping focus on the function of the argument and what are the power relations that are being dislodged or disrupted or reconfigured through those arguments. Otherwise, we're going to end up in total paralysis because any particular argument you think of can be used in pernicious ways. And so then we're in the problem of trying to find the perfect argument that could possibly escape all recombinations. And that's both philosophically mistaken, because to me there's no such argument, but also it's politically dead end, because then we would not be able to avail ourselves of any sort of language. So what I'm saying is that in some cases, people claiming that they are the objects of land theft once you reconstruct the history of that struggle, you can see that is a kind of anti-domination gesture. Whereas in other contexts, it's clearly used to dominate other human beings. And so attending to that requires both understanding the form of that argument, but also its substantive sort of content in any particular case.
Excellent, thank you. So we'll maybe end on one last question. Dirk, as I was hearing you speak, I had a question. I won't pose it to you because I think there's one that's really important that's in the audience, but hearing you speak, and of course, having read the famous essay by Wolf that you noted, thinking about your own work and how you're navigating, of course, on the one hand, genocide studies, on the other hand, settler colonial studies, and thinking especially about the ways that Wolf also kind of names the tensions and the divergencies. And so I was going to push you to think in that way and kind of elaborate for us. But I think the question from an audience member that we have, I'll do my best to pronounce, so hopefully it'll be great. From Tayo Olaruwaju asks, I'm wondering about the relationship of dispossession to international crimes. And I think, Dirk, this is something that I think might be especially relevant to you. It appears the idea of dispossession plays a pivotal role in each of the international crimes of the ICC. And ask, can the panelists share their thoughts on if there's a relationship and to what extent?
Right. Could I ask a bit more detail? I mean, which crimes at the ICC? And yeah, just a little more detail would be good.
Excellent. If we can get a kind of more detailed response, note in the Q&A, that would be wonderful.
I mean, bearing in mind that I'm not an international lawyer.
True. The response is each of the crimes. So if it's too broad of a question and not particularized, I turn it over to you to address how you wish.
Okay. Well, you know, I don't think possessions or dispossession is mentioned in the Genocide Convention. You raised the issue of cultural genocide before, and that was unfortunately excluded explicitly and consciously by the delegates at the United Nations. Not all, but the majority in 1946 and 47. So, you know, cultural genocide has no standing in international law. It's a purely metaphorical concept. However, destruction of heritage did seep its way into another, well, became the object of a convention in the early 1950s. So it's just not in the Genocide Convention. Now, the ICC's charter in the Rome Statute has a long, you know, pages and pages on crimes against humanity. It's sort of disaggregated into a lot of separate ones. You know, apartheid is a crime against humanity, for example. So is the crime of persecution, as well as population expulsions. I can't recall if there's one on dispossession there. But certainly in the Hague Conventions on the laws of occupation, for example, you know, dispossessing an occupied people of their property is definitely illegal in international law, and exploiting their natural resources and so forth. Palestinians always raise this in regard to the West Bank. I mean, there is wriggle room there for the occupying power if it's necessary to victual the local population and so forth, and that's how they get away with it.
Robert, you are welcome to chime in, but I suspect that perhaps that isn't quite in your wheelhouse.
It's not.
All right, fair enough. All right. Well, I think, and on that note for tonight, I think you have given us a lot to think about, especially as we go into tomorrow and think how can the theoretical frameworks travel, or what might their limitations be, and especially as we particularize and historicize and ask those difficult questions of, on the one hand, rubrics that travel, but on the other hand, the need to particularize. So you've given us a lot of food for thought for tomorrow. Thank you both again for your time, and for the audience for being here, the panelists who are kind of backstage with us, and we will hit the ground running tomorrow morning as we continue our conversations. So have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.